Today is October 19th, 2023, and a lot of people are focused on the news of escalating violence in the Middle East. So, a talk on basic ethics to a lot of people would probably seem kind of irrelevant. It's like, how is that really helping anything by getting into this philosophical talk on ethics? But actually, people oftentimes do point out that what's going on is fundamentally wrong because it's violating basic ethics. They just don't say so specifically. They'll say something more like it's unconstitutional. So, just to use the United States context here, when someone says that's unconstitutional, right, whether it's some government restriction on free speech or the right to keep and bear arms, or they're speaking against an invasion of privacy, when they're referring to restrictions against the government listed in what's known as the Bill of Rights, that's actually getting at basic ethics, right? The problem is not identifying it as such, actually, that each of these violations are acts of abuse. And so what really needs to be focused in on is actually the ethics, and not just simply, oh, that violates, like saying that violates the Constitution, or that violates, the Declaration on Human Rights, or whatever Constitution you have, in the area that you live. And I know it can seem like it doesn't have any power to it to actually get specific on the ethics and name the ethical violation or the abuse specifically, but that's actually extremely powerful. So the one thing that people are really kind of marginalizing, or not even discussing much at all, is actually what's most important. And I know, again, like with another, major crisis occurring, a major event of mass violence like we have happening in the Middle East now, it can seem like it doesn't really have any power over something like that. But the thing to recognize is that it was lack of specificity about basic ethics that showed power to develop to an extent that it enables events like this to occur, right? So a major example of this is acceptance of preemptive attack. This idea that some people can initiate violence first, and that is supposedly justifiable if they say, well, it's to prevent another act of violence from happening. The second that this premise is accepted in any to any degree, it's just setting up the stage for one tragedy after another. So just the statement preemptive attack is never justifiable. Like if you do a search for that, if you do an internet search, or if you just search your own memory, can you recall this being something you've ever even heard before, let alone emphasized repeatedly? No, right? If you do a search, I did just as an experiment, you don't get many direct matches whatsoever. There's almost nobody saying those exact words, that preemptive attack is never justifiable. And when you do, what you do find as far as articles or videos and so on, is people talking about preemptive attack as a tactic of self-defense. So not only is the ethical truth that it's always an abusive act not stated, but then it's falsely equated with defensive force, which it is not, right? Preemptive attack is just initiating violence. Therefore, it's an act of aggression in the name of safety, in the name of preventing something from happening. But you should recognize that this is not ethically sound and isn't accepted on a person-to-person level, right? You can't just attack someone on the street, for example, because you think that they might do something harmful to you or someone else in the future, right? We recognize on the person-to-person level that what is legitimate is defensive force, right? If someone actually attacks you or actually attacks someone else, what is ethically sound, what is acceptable, is to use proportional defensive force to end the violence, end the threat. But when we go out of the person-to-person level to the social level, a couple of things happen, both the result of indoctrination and propaganda. People think that the ethics change somehow just by changing the actors from two strangers on the street to hundreds of millions of people and, a few hundred politicians. They think for some reason now the ethics have changed. And they also accept this false equivalency with like parental care being what's going on. So with a parent and their child, right, it's acceptable for the parent to carry out certain measures of control over the child, right? Because the child otherwise would probably hurt themselves and others because of their lack of understanding and awareness, intelligence, ability, and so on. It's appropriate for a parent to have some disciplinary measures and some restrictions put in place for the child's safety. And that is actually legitimate. It's not abusive, right? It can be abusive, right? But if it's done in, you could say, moderate and non-violent way, in a non-abusive way, it's appropriate. However, what happens is people have superimposed that model of parental caretaking onto the government in relation to the population that they're governing. And so they think the legitimacy carries over, but it's a false equivalency. The government isn't our parents, right? If you're an adult, some other adult stranger who happens to be a politician isn't actually your parent, right? Number one, yeah, you're no longer a child, right? And number two, even if you were a child, they're still not your parent. So they're certainly not your parent when you become an adult. And again, this can seem kind of like not that important. Like I'm just getting into some maybe like interesting philosophical perspective here, but it's actually extremely important. I can't emphasize enough how this is actually what needs to be focused on the most. And if you actually put this into practice, meaning like if you actually started pointing out the basic ethics and the basic blunders that fuel the fire of repeated acts of mass destruction and tyranny and escalating totalitarianism, you could actually notice progress. The reason why there hasn't been progress is because the solution has never been really implemented on any significant degree. What has kept a lot of it in check is when people at least go in the right direction, or they'll say something like, well, these are, our rights. These are our constitutional rights, or these are basic human rights. And that actually does have some power to it. But the problem is, because of its still ambiguous nature, where it's not specifically demarcating or identifying the actual ethics, the actual abuse that's occurring, it loses power the more ambiguous it is, the further it is distorted from the core ethical reality. And that core ethical reality is simply the non-abuse principle, right? So Jesus Christ, the Messiah, Yeshua the Messiah, said that all of the moral law and all the teachings of the prophets could be summed up in what he called the greatest commandments. And those greatest commandments are simply commandments of comprehensive love, right? So he made love the primary principle of good. So, and then he identified the three actors that you can express love toward, which are God, others, and yourself, right? So love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Love others and love yourself. And in doing so, he also pointed out to us what is the opposite end of that, the contradiction or violation of that law, right? If loving, befriending action, the verb of love, right, is the moral good, well then the opposite of that is the moral evil, right? So the opposite of befriending someone, which is the basic definition of being loving, is being abusive, right? If you're being abusive, you're not befriending, you're not being friendly, right? So abuse is the violation of the moral law of creation. And so what has happened is that people have been bamboozled and deceived into not recognizing, first of all, that that is the moral law. Again, if you did a search for abuse is evil all the time and, in every scenario, you're going to probably find little to no one saying those exact words or words even, along those lines. So even just the understanding of what is evil actually isn't commonplace. And again, this is actually why the world is the way it is. In the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, just hear this version, you could say, even though I think it's the correct version. Just take this as like a hypothetical, creative perspective on it for the purposes of, making an ethical point, right? You don't have to accept that this is the gospel truth, concerning the Garden of Eden, the story of Adam and Eve, but just hear me out as far as this perspective, again, to help make my ethical point more clear. So Adam and Eve were living in paradise with God, and things were great, right? God said, there's this one tree that I don't want you to eat the fruit from. It's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So the first thing to ask yourself is, well, why wouldn't God want them to have the knowledge of good and evil, right? Like, clearly he is interested in ethics, right? He gave us the 10 Commandments. Again, the Messiah emphasized morality. So he doesn't seem at all to be against morality. So why would he say the one thing that they shouldn't take part in is this knowledge of good and evil? Well, it's because there's a snake on this tree, right, who corrupts that knowledge of good and evil. So what mainstream religion has never shared, in my opinion, is the basic fact that this is illustrating that when people take on corrupted knowledge of good and evil, it results in their downfall. And this is actually made clear in the story too by the fact that once they ate the fruit, which you could say is taking in this false knowledge or believing in a false morality, right? A false knowledge of good and evil. What was the first thing that we hear Adam and Eve, thinking and saying and doing? They suddenly thought that their naked bodies were bad, right? So this is a clear illustration of a mentality based on false morality, right? Because the human body isn't actually inherently evil. Just the human body without clothes on it does not equal evil, right? So there's nothing to be ashamed of, right? But suddenly, after eating this knowledge, right, they had this delusional perspective on the human body, which still goes on to this day, of course, right? Right, just seeing a naked human body is considered criminal, right? But rather than going on about how nudity shouldn't be a crime, the point here is that they lost paradise because they took on a corrupted knowledge of good and evil. And that corrupted knowledge of good and evil is simply a lack of understanding of what is abuse and what is not abuse, right? What is good and what is evil, what's love and what's abuse. So again, returning back to the preemptive attack issue, a lot of people don't see that as an act of abuse, even though it clearly is. And the problem with that is that most of the tyranny, the communism, the totalitarianism, the abuse of control exists because people accept preemptive attack as a legitimate action because they think it's actually morally sound when in fact it's not. So pushing drugs on people, pushing medical devices on people, invading their privacy, increasingly now with biometrics, restricting travel, disarming nonviolent people, extortion, which is the whole foundation of the system. All of these are done because it's said that it will be for the greater good, right? We need to do these abusively controlling things that are actually criminal for to do to another. We need to do these things because it's actually for the greater good. So this returns to this false equivalency with parental care, right? Where a parent will put restrictions on the child for the child's own good, right? Like maybe the parent will restrict certain foods from the child because the parent wants the child to be healthy, right? And if the child is just left on their own to make their own choices about all of their meals, they might make very unhealthy choices consistently, and that would be not in their best interest, right? It wouldn't serve their health and well-being, right? So the parent is putting a restriction on the child, but it really is for the child's own good, and the parent is justified in implementing that discipline or that restriction on the child. So the two key things again here to get are recognizing that false equivalency of the government being parents of adults in a given region, which is false. They shouldn't be considered as such. And also that their actions, which are these acts of preemptive attack, are equivalent with parental care, which they're not. They're just acts of abusive control, and they're presented as if they're parental care, as if they're justifiable. And because that premise is accepted, it just is this true slippery slope that is never ending, right? The encroachments just get more and more severe because the premise is accepted in the first place. And so what are they going to do? They're going to just keep going for as much as they can get because power corrupts, right? So there's these key truths that I'll be repeating that are central to the whole dynamic, and power being a corrupting influence, power being the supposed justified use of abusive force, right? What is political power? It's simply the right to do things, or the ability to do things, the legitimization of acts that are considered unethical for so-called ordinary people to do them, right? Again, extortion being a prime example. But it just gets worse and worse, and people are just treated more and more like livestock, all in the name of safety, all in the name of being cared for, right? So the people are increasingly disarmed, and when a country outlaws guns altogether, then they start doing restrictions even on other tools like knives, and you can only have a knife of this length, and it can't have this kind of assisted control, and they just start micromanaging your life. And now, with the push of these 15-minute cities, like, oh, you can only travel this many times, and you can't travel this much distance, and your car is now going to only be allowed to go on these roads a certain number of times. All right, just further and further totalitarianism, all in the name of safety, all because people accept this premise that these people have the special right to carry out abusive control, which would be recognized as such on the neighbor to neighbor level, right? If you try to carry out these acts of control on just your neighbor or some random stranger, right, it would be considered unacceptable, right? So why is it considered acceptable when these so-called authorities do them? It's because people have been indoctrinated to see them as figures that aren't actually doing anything wrong. They're just taking care of us. They're just taking care of the world, right? Again, a false equivalency. You wouldn't accept some other stranger adult to carry out these actions on you and your family. So why those stranger adults? Just because they're on the TV? Like, what exactly? Just because they have these theatrical productions called elections every now and then that's what makes them legitimate parental overlords of humanity? It doesn't actually hold up to any kind of scrutiny. Saying, well, there are representatives, as I've said before, that's just so clearly untrue. Well, just on a legal basis, right? Like, if you wanted to have someone else be your legal representative, you actually have to give them what's called power of attorney, right? You need a legal document that designates someone as power of attorney, so then they can legally represent you, right? But that's not necessary for politicians, right? All they have to do is have some kind of election, and regardless of how that election turns out, regardless of whether there was tampering occurring or not, whatever, whoever gets 50.01% of the vote, they now are your representative, even if you voted for the opposing candidate. So just on that front, that makes no sense, right? How can someone be your representative if you didn't even vote for them? Or how can someone be your representative if you didn't vote for anybody, right? If you didn't see anyone that you wanted to be your representative. And even if they sounded like they were in line with your own philosophy, what's to prevent them from changing post-election, right? That's just an observable fact of political history, that oftentimes candidates, politicians that said one thing on the during the election campaign didn't follow through once they became elected, or even went against what they were saying they were going to do during the campaign trail. And so this returns to the parallel between political power, politicians in particular, and narcissistic behavior or toxic personality characteristics and patterns of behavior that are pretty well known. You know, certain behaviors have been pointed out as like indicative of a narcissistic personality or the narcissistic personality disorder, right? And one of these behaviors is called future faking. So future faking is where it's basically a way to keep you coming back to the abusive relationship. It's or for you to stay in it, right? By basically telling you false promises, right? False promises should ring a bell for anyone who's paid any attention to politics for any length of time, right? That happens on a recurring basis. They future fake populations. Another well-known characteristic of narcissists is their use of double standards. And again, this actually is one and the same with what I was just talking about concerning what would be considered an abuse for you or I to do. When they do it, it's not considered abusive, right? You can't push drugs on your neighbor and tell them, well, if you don't take my favorite pharmaceutical cocktails here, you're not going to be able to go to work anymore. You're not going to be able to travel. You know, your kid isn't going to be able to go to school, so forth. You can't coerce your neighbor and your neighbor's children to take whatever drugs you want them to just because you think it's the best drug in the world and is going to keep everyone healthy, you know, until the end of time. It's not okay for you or I to do that because that's an act of abusive control. It's treating someone like your livestock. And for that exact reason, it's not legitimate for any human to do that to any other human, right? So it's a double standard. It's saying, oh, well, once you occupy some position of great wealth and power, which happens to be the same employment that has the worst track record in history, right? Mass murder on a regular basis, genocide, democide, you know, mass killing of civilians, massive amounts of oppression, you know, unjust imprisonment, torture, right? Just very common to these folks in these positions of power. And yet somehow these people that have the worst track record are given this double standard of being able to legitimately carry out abuses. Like, how is this making any sense, Mr. or Mrs. Statist? I'm really not seeing the logic. So we just have one crisis after another. We just have increasing levels of oppression and increasing levels of tyranny, of totalitarianism, because of participation with evil, because of acceptance of abuse, because of lack of specificity concerning an ethical violation, right? You're setting up this entire social system based on an act of abuse, which is extortion, which is just given this other label called taxation. And you're told that this is actually how you do your part for society, right? So the thing to understand is that it's all a counterfeit, right? Wanting to help others be part of a community and to have some kind of national identity. These are natural, you could say instinctual things that aren't bad. But when community, you know, when charity and community and being part of a tribe or a nation are presented in a fashion or a vehicle that is based on violence, that's not real community. That's not a genuine article, right? So we're being presented with these counterfeits. And kind of on a side note, that's why among men, sports can be extremely invigorating and popular, is because you get a sense of this lost community or a sense of belonging to a tribe, right? And so an interesting thing to notice actually is that at sports stadiums, particularly soccer, otherwise known as football elsewhere outside the United States, you'll have folks in the crowd waving flags of like more local groups or clans or even bioregions will come up with their own flags. And so you have this sense of like localized unity or community or tribe or even nation that come through. And the sport team is kind of just used as a blueprint of sorts, or, like a weak vehicle to be a foundation of sorts for the nurturing of that mentality of true national identity or true tribal identity or true community. And it's interesting though, because you can also see like an active attack on any kind of independent groups like that, where the state will come in and try and squash these groups of whatever, like say a bioregional group or something like that, and just double down on the state flag being commonplace at the sporting event, right? It's not coincidental that at sporting events, like the state flag is everywhere, like it literally, right? It's on the borders of the field. It's on, of course, on the screen. It's on the basketball backboard. It's on the helmets of the players. It's on their uniforms. You're just bombarded by, hundreds and probably thousands of images of the flag, of the state flag everywhere, right? And it's to kind of get your mind back into the identification with the state as your true nation, your true tribe, your true community, when in fact it's just a parasitic group of extortionists that are deceiving and abusing you. But a lot of life coaches and therapists and so on will advise concerning ending a narcissistic relationship, or how to best deal with one, is to go no contact. They'll say when someone has a mentality that far gone where they're just habitually abusive, and whenever they seem like they're being nice, it's really just to keep you stuck in the pattern of abuse, like future faking being an example of that. Or another term they use is love bombing, where it's just these fake acts of love or friendliness that are really just used to get you hooked and stuck in the toxic relationship. So no contact with the narcissist in political power means sovereignty, means autonomy. It means recognizing that the desire to have community and to help others and to make the world a better place and to have some kind of national identity, there's nothing wrong with any of those things. But thinking that a system based on extortion in particular and a false placement of individuals as parental overlords that have the free pass to be abusive, to think that that's the way to achieve charity, and community and national unity is just mistaken. Like this is the main socialist blunder, is that they'll talk about injustice and inequalities and various forms of oppression, and then they think, well, the way to solve this is setting up a ruling class based on extortion. Right? So this is just a fundamental blunder to think that the way to make the world a better place is actually through comprehensive abuse of everybody on the planet. Right? You can have protection services without extortion. You can have fire departments. You can have medical care. You can have education, all without extortion. Or extortion isn't like this necessary magic ingredient to make these exist in the world. Not only is it not necessary, but you would actually have a higher quality of all of those things without extortion being the foundation, right? Because when things are privatized and localized, there's more accountability rather than people getting paid regardless of their performance, right? You can say, oh, you can vote them out, but that's assuming that the next person, that first of all, that your vote really or have much effect in the first place, that the candidates that you're going to be given as a selection are not pre-selected and not really all part of the same agenda. It just ignores the fact that currently and historically, those that occupy positions of unnatural power and wealth given to them via a system of extortion tend to be the most dishonest and corrupt. And so you're looking to them to be like the arbiters of justice, right? Like to be the perfect parental overlords of humanity. Like, it doesn't actually make sense that you're putting more faith in this social arrangement than you would in non-abusive voluntary relations. Again, it ignores the key fact of life that power corrupts, right? So you're giving them this unnatural power, right? You're saying you can take money out of everyone's paycheck automatically, no matter what you do, your ruling class is going to just get this never-ending funding and hoping for the best, right? Thinking like, well, that's not going to have any negative effect. That's not going to lead to any kind of corruption. It's going to read a little excerpt here that's quoting Murray Rothbard in his book For a New Liberty. So it says, if you wish to know how the libertarians regard the state and any of its acts, he wrote in For a New Liberty, simply think of the state as a criminal band, and all the libertarian attitudes will logically fall into place. He reduces the libertarian creed to one central axiom, quote, that no man or group of men may aggress against the person or property of anyone else, end quote. Neither the state nor any private party, therefore, can initiate or threaten the use of force against any person for any purpose. Free individuals should regulate their affairs and dispose of their property only by voluntary agreement based on contractual obligation. So, again, this return to basic ethics is just overlooked and, marginalized and disregarded as not that important or not practical, right? They'll say something like, well, in a perfect world, we could, go by Yeshua, the Messiah's, law of love. But the world isn't perfect. And there's bad people out there. And so what we actually need to do is violate that law in the interest of making the world a better place. We need to give people positions of unnatural power that enable them to carry out criminal acts and for it to be completely legitimate and acceptable when they do so. And that's actually how we're going to make the world a better place. That's the less naive strategy for social justice. But it's self-contradictory, right? That should be obvious when it's spelled out, right? These people that are being given this unnatural power could be the bad people themselves, right? And this is actually returning to the parallel with narcissism, right? Narcissists always want to be able to get away with their abuse, right? That's why they do things like love bomb and future fake. They want to be able to get away with it. They don't want to be exposed and abandoned, right? They're parasitic. They need the host. They need you to stick around, right? And so even though who would be rightfully, designated like a true narcissist or toxic personality is a small percentage of the total global population. I've heard estimates like something like maybe 10%. They actually tend to be the vast majority of those in positions of political power. And this makes perfect sense because, again, if a narcissist wants to be able to abuse with impunity, wants to be able to get away with abuse, what better occupation than the one in which abuse is actually legitimized, right? You're actually serving the people, right? You're actually being a public servant by carrying out abuse to varying degree all the time, basically, right? Doing abusive control, like, again, just to give huge examples, like bombing civilians, right? If an ordinary person just dropped a bomb on a town, right, they would be put to death, right? They'd be given the death penalty because that's horrific, right? But if someone in position of political power does it, well, no, they're just doing what's necessary for the greater good, right? Again, if you tried to push drugs on your neighbor, or you tried to disarm them, or you started doing any other kind of invasive, abusive act like invading their privacy, right? These are all considered not ethical, but when done by people in these positions of political power, it's all considered legitimate, right? So what more attractive occupation for the narcissist than that? And that's why it makes sense that the majority of those in political power are narcissists, because they're given a free pass, right? They don't have to worry about no contact or losing their host, losing their narcissistic supply, because it's just given to them automatically. And the supply can't leave, right? And if the supply tries to leave, well, then you can call them criminal. You can call them selfish, right? You can do all the things that they were doing on the small scale, but you can just continue with it on a larger scale, right? You can label them extremist. You can, call them dangerous and so on, unpatriotic, selfish, etc. But for those on the supply side, it can be a hard realization to come to. It can be very disturbing to think that those that you look to be your protectors and leaders are actually more, like I said, a parasitic ruling class that is just set on exploiting and abusing you, right? It's like when someone realizes that they've been dealing with a narcissistic parent, right? You can be in denial for a really, really long time because you don't want to see them in that way, right? It can be really devastating. You have identified yourself with them as part of, a loving family. And so when it's revealed to be a counterfeit, when it's revealed, well, this wasn't actually a loving parent, this was someone that was sabotaging and, undermining my life on a regular basis, it can be really difficult. And so what can be easier to do is what is known as Stockholm Syndrome, where you actually support those that are taking you captive or those that are abusing you. And you would actually resist anyone trying to point out to you that, hey, you're being abused right now. You're under abusive control. And you'll see those that are trying to point that out to you as the dangerous ones, right? Or, in a religious context, or they'll call them the heretic or the apostate, and, the false teacher, and so on. They'll just throw all these labels at them to make them the danger, when in fact it's the deceptive institution that has been misleading them that is really the danger to their lives. And speaking of the counterfeits, so again, natural, I would say to men in particular, having a like instinctual drive to be a protector, is wanting to be, some men wanting to be part of what you could call like a warrior class. And the military is the counterfeit of this. And a very simple way to just expose that is to recognize that there's this chain of command, right, that ultimately goes up to a politician who's called the commander-in-chief, right? So a lot of folks in the military will oftentimes say, like, we don't get involved in politics, yet at the same time, they're taking commands from a politician. So that's self-contradictory. You're obviously involved in politics if you're taking orders from a politician, right? So, a lot of folks in the military, especially with the new so-called commander-in-chief, didn't like the idea of having to take orders from them, orders from that administration. But they're told, well, this is just the way it is. This is you doing your duty. This is how you're actually going to be defending the Constitution, right? They'll again also return to the Constitution, which is returning to the idea that ethics do actually matter, right? Like, if we don't have a sound ethical foundation of some kind, then anything goes. And since power corrupts, and that's, like the second law of thermodynamics, in society, in the political world, is just a given. It's always in operation, always has been, always will be. This entropy, this corruption, is just always going to be happening. It doesn't actually make sense to be part of a warrior class that is in that arrangement of dependency and submission to some political leader, right? That's not actually being the best defender of your community or nation, right? Because you're detached again from the fundamental ethics, right? You're saying, oh, I'm going to follow the lead of this politician because it was to follow the lead of the Constitution, which is supposed to be based on these fundamental ethics. So rather than going through the politician and the Constitution, which actually is more about Article 1, Section 8, establishment of taxation, and that is the amendments that were added on, called the Bill of Rights, right? But I won't digress there too much on giving a brief summary, cliff notes of the book Hologram of Liberty. My point being that it's another counterfeit, right? It's natural and good to want to be a protector of your family, of your community, of your nation. But a military establishment that, part of the political institution, is not actually the genuine article, once again. What would be millions of independent local militias that aren't part of that chain of command that goes to, some office in a far off place, right? By folks with immense power and wealth that tend to be corrupted by that power and wealth, right? Less trustworthy. And this is why the education system is fundamental to keeping this whole thing going, because all of those thousands of hours, all those years from a young age, being indoctrinated to accept, okay, these are the authorities, whatever they say is true and good is true and good, and my obedience to their orders equals me being a good person, right? That being instilled, on the conscious and subconscious level, over and over and over and over again for years and years and years and years, especially during the developmental years, results in acceptance of these counterfeits. And that, combined with the lack of any alternatives, like I was saying, with like a bioregional group or other sovereignty movements, or localization movements, or state secession movements, people even identifying with their local state is going in the direction. But these are, again, vehemently attacked, because anything going in the direction of independence is going in the direction of ending the abusive relationship, right? Recognizing that people should be able to choose their relationships, form contractual agreements, as that quote I was just reading was talking about, that free individuals should regulate their affairs and dispose of their property only by voluntary agreement based on contractual obligation. Right? That is actually the right foundation. Thinking that these exceptions to God's law, to the divine rule, are going to actually be the less naive and less problematic way to go for society, is just logically irrational. Like, it just doesn't hold up to just logical analysis, and it's also historically, demonstrably false. So this return to basic ethics and getting very specific, like saying, again, the actual phrases like preemptive attack is never legitimate, right? Like, abuse is always evil. Disarming nonviolent people is abusive. Abuse is always evil, right? Pushing drugs, coercing people to take drugs is abusive. Abuse is always evil. Like, getting to those specific statements, that would actually have power. You could say, well, what difference is it going to make? Well, a lot, because the whole supposed legitimacy of this entire system is based on false morality. So when you speak the true morality, it's like hit on that false core of this whole, like Death Star. It's like Luke Skywalker, shooting that missile right to the center of the big beast world. Another way people are deceived into continuing to go along with the system is that they're victims of what's known as gaslighting, where your own perception of reality is hijacked and replaced with a viewpoint that supports the system. So controlled opposition is oftentimes used for this purpose. So they have you continuing to look for an event that has already happened. So to give a specific example, I just came across a video where a guy was talking about, like, communism is coming to the United States, right? And this was just put out recently, like this month, October 2023. Communism is coming? No, it's already come, right? So the state claiming ownership of the most fundamental form of private property, which is your own body, by saying that they get to choose what goes into it and what goes on it, and where you can move, treating you exactly like livestock, treating you exactly like a cow or a pig on some farmer's farm. That is communism to the extreme, right? Disarming nonviolent people, that's communism, right? And while we're on the topic, right, if you actually read the Communist Manifesto, what are two pillars that Marx and Engels gave for a communist society? Income tax, otherwise known as the 16th Amendment, brought in 1913, right? Along with central bank, here known as the Federal Reserve, right? Also brought in 1913. So communism came big time in 1913, and then even more so 2020 through 2023 now, with medical tyranny, with this totalitarianism and further push of control of the minutia of your daily life, right? Pushing these 15-minute cities, saying how far you can travel, what vehicles you can use to travel, on and on and on. So, by distracting you with foreign events and various enemies, right, you're never going to be looking to them as actually the number one problem, right? It's like with the narcissistic parent, they oftentimes can seem like they're helping you, right? But that help is actually just help that you wouldn't have needed in the first place if you hadn't been undermined from the start, right? If you hadn't been disempowered from the get-go, and so been put in this position of continual dependency. And then so when they keep giving you this minimal help that just keeps you stuck in that dependency, it seems like, oh yeah, they're my caretaker, they're helping me. But meanwhile, that was just to reinforce their supposed legitimacy and goodness and keep you coming back, keep the cycle of dependency going on and on. So again, sidestepping the fundamental ethics can seem like no big deal, but it's actually the biggest deal. It's the biggest problem. It can seem like, well, I'm just going to try and do my best and live my life and, just deal with events as they transpire. But you have to recognize that there is this true slippery slope again of a system that is enabling folks to have an unnatural power to abuse, right? And if you think that can be ignored and not called out and things are somehow going to work themselves out, it's just a false perception. And even calling out again to saying, well, it's unconstitutional. Well, that's not actually getting at the root, because you have to recognize, well, the Constitution, again, was more about legitimizing taxation, legitimizing extortion, legitimizing centralized power in the first place, legitimizing this idea of representation that is not of the true power of attorney legal sort, and thinking that false foundation isn't going to be problematic, right? Isn't going to result in greater and greater corruption and possibly nuclear war, right? Killing the majority, if not all, people on Earth, right? This is no small thing, right? There's nothing more dangerous than legitimizing abuse and funding those abusers continuously. And that's exactly what has been set up as the foundation of civilization, right? So by simply stating ethical facts like taxation is theft, representation is a lie, it can seem like, well, there's no real power to that. When in fact they're extremely powerful statements of truth, because they're crucial truth. Some facts are more important than others, especially concerning social justice, right? 2 + 2 = 4 isn't as important as taxation is theft. It's not as important as preemptive attack is never legitimate. Preemptive attack is just a form of abuse. Abuse is a violation of God's law and should never be accepted, right? Disarming nonviolent people is an act of abuse. Abuse is always evil, is a violation of God's law, should never be accepted under any circumstance. Coercing people to take drugs for supposed public safety is an act of abuse of control. Abuse is always evil. It's a violation of God's law. It should never be accepted. Period. If these were actually common statements, if this was like part of the national identity, we'd have a very different world, right? We'd have a very different world where these unethical and false ideas, right, that some abuse is legitimate sometimes and that representation is true, right? If these falsehoods weren't accepted as fact, we could actually build a true just society where people are respected as individuals and given sovereign space, land, water, and seed to have independence from the system, but also any other people, and that being a foundation for a just voluntary society. I would say the lack of consensus on acceptance of these crucial truths is directly correlated, directly connected to the state of society. Like I said, when you do a search for statements like these, it's just either nothing, it's either crickets, or it's misinformation, right? Like I said, false equivalencies like preemptive attack equals defensive force, or, if you do a search for disarming nonviolent people as a form of abuse, like, you're not going to get much of anything, or you're just going to get, again, a lot of misinformation. There's no common acceptance of the most important crucial truths that could actually set the world right, which all return to the perfect moral law given by the Messiah, the Savior of humanity, right? Not coincidentally, right? That makes sense that he, being the Savior of humanity, gave the perfect moral law that can save us from destruction, right? Save us from bondage, free us from bondage, return us to paradise, right? If we stop eating the corrupted knowledge of good and evil and instead just stick to the pure knowledge of good and evil, which is the greatest commandments, which is the law against all abuse, all aggression, deception, and theft. That's what abuse is. It comes in those three forms: aggression, which is the initiation of violence; deception; and theft or stealing. Right? Aggression, deception, and theft. Again, if that was common knowledge, that would have a very powerful effect. If there was consensus that initiating violence, deceiving others, and stealing from others should never be accepted under any circumstance. If that was actually the ethical foundation, we wouldn't have these systems of destruction set up in the first place. Perfect occupations for narcissistic abusers in existence in the first place. And we wouldn't have this escalation of oppression, totalitarianism, and mass violence, where, again, things like bombing whole, neighborhoods or towns or cities is seen as somehow acceptable or an act of defense. Defensive force is an act of love when it's in response to an actual act of violence and it's proportional to that violence. One of the main deceptions of the church is the mistranslation of what Jesus said concerning self-defense. He said not only an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but if someone strikes you on your jaw, return to them one of the same kind likewise. But they mistranslated that as if someone, strikes you on the cheek, strikes you on the jaw, turn the other one toward them, as if you're inviting abuse, as if the Messiah was saying, if someone's abusing you, turn your cheek to invite even more. That obviously contradicts his law of love, right, which includes self-love. And it's a clear mistranslation. If you just analyze the Greek, you can see that an equally valid translation is, again, like I said, that you should return to them one of the same kind, likewise, meaning proportional defensive force, one of the same kind. They hit your right jaw, you hit their right jaw, right? Not they hit your right jaw and you kill them or you bomb their town. No, right? Because that's excessive force, and so therefore it's abuse, therefore it's evil, therefore it's a violation of God's law. The ethics really isn't complicated. No initiation of violence, no deception, no theft. Defensive force that's proportional to the attack committed is not an act of abuse, it's actually an act of love. Right? If you defend your child from being hurt by some stranger, that's an act of love. If you defend yourself from being attacked by somebody, that's an act of love. If you do it for a stranger, same thing. Right? Common sense ethics. Removed from the mystification of propaganda, which is the devil on the tree corrupting the knowledge of good and evil. Again, the fundamental ethics does matter. And, whatever premise or precedent they're trying to set does matter. And if you have that confused, then all the unnecessary suffering will continue to go on. So again, crucial truths like being violent in the name of safety is illegitimate. Initiating violence is not okay, right? Aggression is never okay. Theft is never okay. Deception is never okay. Period. If that could just be, again, part of common vernacular, common understanding, if, that was actually part of the education of children, rather than these counterfeit, false moral views, which are detached from the fundamental ethics, we could have a transition back to a more sane and pleasant society. And again, no contact or real independence really is the key. Otherwise, you're just plugging one hole that's leaking some kind of abuse just for another one to follow it, because it's not stopping the flow of abuse that's going on continuously, right? It's not stopping the fact that the foundation of the water flow is, the water flow being symbolic here of, one abuse after another. It's not recognizing that it's the dynamic of power corrupting people and a karmic retribution for violating God's law going on continuously. So if you just think, well, okay, let's try and sue the courts, sue the governor or whoever for doing this action over here, and let's try and stop this bad law over here, and it's just never ending. It's just damage control, never ending, because the foundation is faulty, right? It's based again on acceptance of abuse, namely extortion and false representation, and just thinking that can be overlooked and we can somehow make things right. But that's not the way it works. That's not the way creation is set up. If you violate God's law, there's negative consequences, period. So thinking that you can set up society on a violation of God's law and on false morality and that it's going to work out is just false. And again, recognize where most of the worst abuses come from. They come from the institutions of greatest wealth and power, where there's the most corruption, right? From the political establishment, from the economic establishment, right? From the educational establishment. This isn't coincidental, right? It's because these institutions are based on immorality and actually run by the most evil at the top of the chain of command. And so if you continue to be subject to that chain of command and dependency on them, that is just going to perpetuate the cycle of abuse, perpetuate the toxic relationship that should actually be discontinued, which means ending the abuse founded on false morality and lies.